For this session, Professor Gurnamita Dasgupta, Nitya Gopal Jha, Prabhat Patnaik, and of course the messages from the IPSP report, the key messages will be conveyed to us by Professor Ravi Kantla. I think the society and the economic structure, they are changing very rapidly in recent years. Of course, this is not the, particularly after the French Revolution, we have seen rapid changes in the social structure, in the way society is organized, in the way the politics is organized. But in the economic sphere, particularly, major changes came after the Industrial Revolution and subsequent technological revolutions, which continues even now. The economic growth in different countries or at the global level, they have been very different now, much more than what one could have anticipated, say, about a century ago. Certainly in India, in the last 25 years, we have noticed about 7 to 8% growth, 7% even if we take a somewhat longer term average of 25% years, compared to about 4% in the previous 25 years. So while the overall volume of the economic activity is expanded quite a bit, several questions also arise. Who benefits from this growth process? Do some sections benefit more than others, or are some sections completely getting neglected also in the process? Is it helping in poverty reduction? Everybody admits that there has to be growth for rapid poverty reduction, but at the same time almost everybody also recognizes that growth by itself is not sufficient. But apart from all this, are increase in expansion of economic activity, is it leading to better provision of health services for the people? Is the current generation, are they able to have access to better education for their children? These are also questions almost everybody in the society is raising, and at the same time, questions are also coming up on the social stability issues. There is also a view that unless we have social stability, the growth process itself will be jeopardized. These are several questions that arise in the context of social progress. There are many other issues, like environment and other issues. So we look forward to a very exciting session today, and the key messages will be given to us by Professor Ravi Kantla. Professor Kantla also happens to be the co-chair of the Scientific Council of the International Panel on Social Progress, and he is also PhD Professor of World Affairs and International Professor of Applied Economics and Management at Cornell.
Okay, good. Well, our friends, thank you very much indeed for coming. I'm very pleased to start off these proceedings, but I hope I only start off the proceedings. I'm sure we'll have a lot of good discussion on this. Let me first of all say that I'm not going to be giving you the messages of the report, because as you'll see when I talk about the report, it is actually virtually impossible to give you the messages of the report. It's so comprehensive and so broad and so wide and so on and so forth. So I will introduce the work of the panel, and I will say a few things from my perspective. And we have sort of some of the authors of the report here. They will say things from their perspective. So you'll see that the notion of giving the messages of the report is perhaps a misnomer. So here's the report. It's called Rethinking Society for the 21st Century. The website is IPSP.org. And these are the 3 volumes of the report. And there's a small book which will come out in November called A Manifesto for Social Progress, which is led by Marc Flerbet. And then many of us have contributed to the small book. So what's the motivation for this? It's basically the following, and Dr. Sorry. So Professor Panda alluded to this, that despite considerable progress in social indicators, and we'll see some of those at the global and national levels, we clearly live in anxious times. We clearly live in anxious times. And this was the reason why a group of us a few years ago constituted this International Panel on Social Progress. The website is IPSP.org, and you can go to that and download everything that I'm going to say to you now. The panel consists of more than 300 scholars. There are some of them in that photograph. They're all disciplines, so social sciences and humanities, and actually from everywhere. We have 3 of them from India from the panel. So just to repeat, the 300 plus scholars is an advisory committee which is headed by Amartya Sen. There's a scientific council of which I co-chair with philosopher Nancy Fraser and sociologist Helga Novotny. There's a steering committee which is led by Olivier Bouin and Marc Flerbet. Marc Flerbet, some of you know, is a professor at Princeton. He's a sort of a mathematical economist, but he's French, so he likes to talk about philosophy and Descartes and all this sort of stuff. So he brings the breadth to knowledge. The Collège d'Études Mondiales in Paris and Princeton are among the sponsors of this. And there are the Gulbenkian Foundation and Friedrich Ebert Foundation and so on. There's so many. You'll notice that there's no state funding for this. That was by design. Marc Flerbet, who was the moving force behind this, said he didn't want state funding for this exercise. So the objectives of the panel are to provide a comprehensive coverage of the multiple dimensions of social progress, to make up-to-date social science more accessible and relevant, to feed social actors and citizens with ideas about possible futures, and also to raise interest in social justice and the long-term perspective among thinkers and actors. Those are our sort of main objectives. The outputs of the report, as I said, there's a website, and I think this is very important. There are downloadable drafts of all the papers, the pre-publication drafts of all of them, so you don't have to buy the report. You see here, sorry. There will be, no doubt, an Indian edition in due course. But there's teaching material, there's video interviews of the authors, everything is on the IPSP.org website, so that's an important thing for students to realize. The first report, as I said, is a 3-volume report which has just come out, and then there's a small book which will come out later on in this month, I believe. The topics of the report, broadly speaking, are discussion of what is social progress. We decided not to have first of all, we decided not to have an index of social progress, because then the Ministry of Finance would put out a notice saying we disagree with this, depending on where India ranked and where other countries ranked. But also, we decided not to have a definite definition of social progress. There's a discussion in the whole chapter on it, and Nirja will talk about that chapter, I believe, right? And then the socioeconomic transformation, inequality, cities, labor, capitalism, and so on. And then governance and politics. And then also values and cultures. Okay, so it's a very broad a range of issues that are being discussed in this report. Here's a list of chapters. There are 22 chapters. So we start with social trends and new geographies, then we go on to inequalities and so on, and inequalities is my particular area, so I'm going to discuss that in this talk. But you know, on cities, corporations, the future of work. Then we come to politics, violence, wars, peace and security, media communications, and then over there, in terms of values, norms and cultures, there's sort of families and religious communities and so on. Okay. And then chapter 22 is the contribution of social sciences to policy and institutional change. So a very broad canvas, and many people have painted on this canvas. On average, there'll be about a dozen authors for each of these chapters. So you might ask these authors how they managed to get consensus amongst 12 social scientists in a room. That's an interesting question to ask. So there you are. That's just a broad introduction. Much more information is available on IPSP.org. Those are the 3 volumes of the report, and that's the small book that So let me start with this. You recognize it, of course. It was the best of times, it was the worst of times. It was the age of wisdom, it was the age of foolishness. It was the epoch of belief, it was the epoch of incredulity. It was a season of light, it was a season of darkness. It was a spring of hope, it was a winter of despair. We had everything before us, we had nothing before us. Although it was obviously written as a prelude to the French Revolution, I put it to you that it's eerily descriptive of our own time. And the point is that in many respects, the world as a whole, on average the world as a whole, for the world as a whole, this has actually, the period after the Second World War has indeed been the best of times. And we'll see some of those times. There's been no global conflagration like the Second World War. And to the extent that you believe any of these GDP numbers, it took 1,000 years up to 1950 for world per capita GDP to multiply by 15. It took only 60 years for it to multiply by 4 in the next 60 years. Here's a classic hockey stick diagram for many developed countries. Nothing happens for 1,000 years, or more than 1,000 years, and then suddenly we start. So of course you say, well, that's all income and so on. You economists always talk about income. Yes, let me just continue with the income story for a minute. In 1978, China's per capita GDP was twice what it was in the year 1000. 30 years later, it was 6 times its value in 1978. Similarly, for India, tremendous, compared to the previous 1,000 years, there's been tremendous economic growth in the last 25, 30, 35 years, since independence. The global poverty ratio, you say, well, this is all average income, what about global poverty ratio? Again, using conventional measures, conventional poverty lines, etc., it has fallen from 42% in 1981 to 11% in 2013. We can discuss the technical detail, but I think the broad thrust of this is fairly clear. Here's the diagram, these are the years, and this is the poverty ratio, the headcount ratio, using poverty line $1.90 per day. Okay. This is the dotted line is the trend for China, this is the trend for the world as a whole. You think income is not the right thing to look at? Life expectancy has increased dramatically. Infant mortality has fallen dramatically. These are global averages. So, in many ways, it has been the best of times. You'd have to argue against these broad trends to say that it wasn't, on average, the best of times. There you go, those are some graphs. The dark line is life expectancy, the light line is primary completion rates, and so on. And yet, there's no question that the sense of anxiety is just palpable in our politics. There's Trump, there's Brexit, there's demands for Scottish independence, Catalan independence, there's far-right parties in Western Europe, subversion of democracy in Eastern Europe, and then there's conflict and threats to democracy in Africa, Hindu fundamentalism, Islamic fundamentalism, and on and on. Okay. And of course, we have environmental damage. I'm not going to be talking about that in my talk because we have Purnamita who will discuss that relevant chapter. So what's going on? What's going on? So let me just concentrate on my little bit, the sort of income part of the story and poverty part of the story. Here's one sense in which the numbers might give you might give you a wrong handle on things. This is a chart, but the horizontal axis is years. The light line is the fraction of people in Africa in poverty, going down along with the global poverty rate. The dark line is the absolute number of people in poverty in Africa. Because of course the fraction can fall, but the total number can rise because the population is rising. And it's the dark lines, these people are the ones who are getting on the boats, getting ready to get on the boats to come across the Mediterranean. Okay? The poverty rate is falling, but the absolute number of people who are deprived is risen in the African context. So that's just one way in which the picture is different depending on how you look at it. Here's a sort of a graph which is famous amongst income distribution analysts, economists who analyzing the distribution. It's called the elephant graph for obvious reasons. On the horizontal axis is the different points of the income distribution, from the lowest to the highest, from the poorest to the richest. The vertical axis is the income growth that's happened in that part of the distribution over the last 20 years, from 1988 to 2008. And the red line is the average, and you'll see above and below average performance. This is for the world as a whole. Okay? This is for the entire world as a whole. What you do is you combine household surveys from different parts of different countries to construct this global distribution, which is what Lackner and Milanovic did. Well, of course, there's one part which stands out. This group here, who are the 80th to 90th percentile of the world distribution, they're quite well off, so far as the world is concerned, who've done rather badly. Who are these people? These are the people who voted for Trump. These are the people who voted for Brexit. Okay? It's the white working class in the US, in Europe, who are actually well positioned in terms of the world income distribution, but have actually lost out in the last 20 years, relatively speaking. So these are the sorts of entry points into the anxieties of our time. Here's another little graph, which is international migrants. Okay. This is years, and on the horizontal axis, the vertical is the percentage of the world's population that is migrants, the stock of the world's population that is living in countries where they were not born. If you look at the figure, the number, it's about 3.5%, 3.4% of the world's total stock of the world is migrant. So it's not that much. Why are we so concerned about it? Why is there all this anxiety about migration? Well, first of all, look at the rate of increase. And secondly, of course, yes, it's true, if migration was distributed evenly around the world, there wouldn't be an issue. But it's not. Okay? 15% of Germany's population is actually born outside. And it's not just a Western European and US issue. Okay? You only have to walk down the streets of Kuala Lumpur to realize there's a lot of migration going on in the Asian context. You only have to walk down the streets of Johannesburg to realize there's a lot of migration, cross-border migration going on in the African context. And those are the anxieties of our time. And I'm not going to discuss, there's obviously global warming and so on, I couldn't be able to discuss these things. From another chapter in the report about terrorist incidents and so on. So, the picture that we have is one of undoubted progress upwards, in some sense, but of huge chasms opening up. And the report sort of discusses many of these things in detail. I've only had obviously I can only scratch the surface here. But huge chasms into which this progress will fall for generations to come. Now, I'm not going to be able to cover everything that's in this report, but what I want to do in the rest of this talk, very briefly, is to touch on two issues and relate them together. The issue of rising inequality and the issue of global institutions. I believe that these are contributing to the anxieties of our time. But inequality, everybody says we're in an age of rising inequality. Actually, inequality is also a best of times, worst of times story. I don't want to go into the technical details of measurement of inequality and so on, but if one applies the intuitive standard of the gap between rich and poor, just a very intuitive standard, a fairly consistent story emerges about global patterns. What is that story? The story is the following. I can sort of piece it together. Inequality in the US fell for about 3 decades after the Second World War. But after that, from about the late 70s, early 80s, it started rising. This is the famous Piketty and all that sort of stuff. Inequality has also risen in the UK, in parts of Europe, in China, India, Bangladesh, etc. So what's the good news? The good news, if we leave aside the last 5 years or so, is that inequality in Latin America has fallen in the last 20 years, 25 years. It's not risen. So the statement, we're living in an age of rising inequalities, is false if you mean it's rising everywhere. You might ask the question, why is it falling and so on, and that we can discuss that. But it is falling in these parts of the world. The further good news from the global inequality perspective is that all these countries like China, India, and so on grew faster than the US and Europe. So China is doing 10%, the US is barely breaking 2%. So obviously the gap on average between the US and China is closing. And that's an important component of global inequality. And putting all of this together, actually, as Lackner and Milanovic do, the world Gini coefficient has actually fallen in the last 20 years. It's not risen. So purely factually, in that sense, we're not living in an age of rising inequality. That's the good news part of the story. What then is there to worry about? What's the worry? What's the anxiety? Well, in my view, there are several. But one of them is this massive technological trend, which is displacing basic labor in favor of skilled labor and capital. And unchecked, this is going to lead to a concentration of market income. Its manifestations are already felt in the US and the UK, but obviously, you remember that elephant graph, the bit in that bit, or the dip, that's this bit. And where these trends have not yet fully appeared, as in parts of Asia, or where they've been countered by policy, as in the case of Latin America, there's no room for complacency, because in Latin America, for example, they're having to run to stand still, against this technological trend. So the trend is the sense in which we are living in an age of rising inequality. The fact that global inequality as a whole has declined because poorer countries have grown faster than richer countries, or in some countries inequality has fallen. Okay. It's fine, but the sense in which we're living in an age of rising inequality is this technological juggernaut, this trend that's coming. Will this come again?
Yes, it's come.
Okay. So as I said, this is the sense in which we're living in an age of rising inequality. And we can go into all sorts of details on each of these points, okay? But I don't have that much time. So there's a second sense in which we're living in an age of rising inequality, and it's the following, which is that compared to 40 years ago, compared to 50 years ago, the global constraints on domestic policy towards mitigating inequality are now greater than they were a half a century ago. So I want to just say a few words about what those types of global constraints are. Here are some constraints. Okay. They said mobility, the fact of mobility of capital and skilled labor, okay, leads to a race to the bottom in terms of tax rates on these factors. And therefore, governments can't raise sufficient revenue to actually correct, to do the redistribution, or to do the education, or to do the health, etc., that is called for by this technological trend. So even if illicit evasion was overcome, people say, well, there's all these illicit evasion. Yeah, that's fine. Even if you address that, there's perfectly legal tax competition, race to the bottom type issues which are going on, and which are actually affecting revenue hugely. Here's a chart of corporate tax rates in the different parts of the world. Notice the trend, okay, in the last few years. Now, you can say maybe there are economic fundamentals which mean that tax rates are going down. You could say corporate taxes were too high and it's good that they come down, etc. But surely part of the story is this global competition of tax competition, which is actually reducing government revenues and therefore reducing the capacity of governments to actually deal with this rising inequality, the trends of rising inequality, the forces of rising inequality. Similarly, with mobility of low income unskilled labor, if you adopt redistributive policies at the bottom end of the distribution, and that attracts low income unskilled migrants from elsewhere, that clearly puts a constraint on you to conduct this redistribution. And you have to think about many countries who are facing exactly that sort of issue. And there's a lot of empirical work actually showing that the presence of migrants reduces the redistributiveness of jurisdictions. But the point is, just as there's no global institution, proper global institution to address the race to the bottom on tax rates, there is no global institution to address these sorts of cross-border spillover effects. And finally, consider the problem of incentivizing public investment from labor-saving technical change. And the notion that we couldn't do it, people sort of raise their eyebrows. Here, roll their eyes, say, how can you possibly do this? But the point is that we have actually in the past invested public funds to change the direction of technical progress. The internet is what it is today because the public sector invested in it. Actually, it was the military that invested in it. And they said, well, you know, if there's a nuclear strike on this part, we want this bit of the network to still survive. And that was a problem they posed too in those research laboratories, and they solved the problem in this way. Similarly, the Green Revolution, you know, the reason why Norman Borlaug was in a field in Mexico working on high-yielding varieties and so on was not because the private sector dictated it, but because the public sector put him there to do this. So, but public sector investment of this type faces all the sorts of standard problems of global public goods, and we don't have global institutions to address global public goods type of issues. So that's the major theme, certainly in my writing and also in this report. So this is the point. Managing national import is difficult because of cross-border spillover effects. But there are lots of other spillover effects which are discussed in the report, including environmental and so on. The world clearly needs institutions to address these spillovers. In other words, the world needs institutions to address global public goods, but the institutions that we have are not fit for purpose. That, to me, is a second dimension of the anxiety. Let me conclude by giving you one example, which is the World Bank, where I used to work, and I still get my pension from the World Bank, so long may it survive. But you know, the World Bank is a jewel in the crown of post-war global economic performance. It made its contribution through the sovereign loan instrument, through a loan instrument which intermediate between funds in New York and needs of infrastructure in bombed-out Europe and Japan, and contributed to the golden age of capitalism. But its key instrument, the sovereign loan instrument, where you lend to a country and get money back from a country, is almost by definition unsuited to addressing cross-border spillover issues, where you need, in some sense, a group decision, a group analysis of this thing for multi-countries, sometimes 3 countries, sometimes 7 countries, etc. A specific sovereign loan instrument is not suited to that. And that's an example of how an institution which was brilliant 75 years ago is now is not suitable now anymore for the big issues of today. And finally, just to conclude, the governance structures reflect the power structures of 1945, not today. So, an element of the charter of the World Bank is that you need 85% of the votes to change the charter of the World Bank. So anybody who has more than 15% of the votes has veto power over the charter of the World Bank. And that country is the US. So the reason why the World Bank's capital is stuck where it is when the needs of the world are growing is because the US doesn't want to put money in. The other countries want to put money in, but if they do, the US share will go down below 15%, and then it will lose veto power. So it's actually vetoing the removal of its veto through a natural thing, which is to increase the total capital that this institution should be using for these global issues. So an institution which reflects the power structures of 1945 is not anymore fit for purpose for the current. So this is the anachronism of the US veto of the World Bank. And there are many such examples, and the report discusses them. There's a chapter in the report on these global institutions. So let me conclude. The last 75 years have seen enormous global progress in many dimensions. I think you'll have to agree with me on that. Yet we live in an anxious age, there's no argument about that. And the reasons for this are various, but I pointed to national challenges and global challenges which threaten to swallow our steady march of progress. The 2 challenges that I focused on at the national level is this underlying force for increasing inequality, the technological change force. And at the global level, the lack of global institutions to address the global spillovers, which will occur when each country tries to address these inequalities. Now, in this talk, I'm afraid I've only introduced the IPSP report, and I've barely scratched the surface of its content. And the report itself contains much broader and deeper analysis, so I invite you to delve into the IPSP report. Thank you very much.
Interventions from the IPSP authors. The first one is by Professor Purnamita Dasgupta. She is my colleague at the IEG and chair professor in environmental economics.
We will put up a little bit with problems in this and treat as part of the progress agenda. So, good afternoon, everyone. And hello to my guests as being part host of this event. So I was CLA of this chapter on economic growth, human development and planetary welfare. And from these very words, you can understand why our chapter had the largest number of authors. It was double the average for the other other chapters, because there were so many views the moment one started trying to bring these very weighty words together and come to a consensus on what they mean when you put them together. So I was just sort of linking to Ravi's presentation and looking at some of the Indian data. And in general, this holds true for South Asia as for other parts of the world, and in India too, that we do see some positive correlations between economic growth and most of the markers of human development, be it life expectancy, be it literacy, and so on. So one of the first messages that started emerging for us as authors was that the size of the cake matters. So de-escalation of growth, which seems to be an argument that is coming up in some of the literature, is not something that probably South Asia at least is ready for at the moment. And just to look at the kind of numbers in absolute poverty, Ravi also spoke about them. The red band is there happened in South Asia between 1990 and 2030. It's very evident that the size of the cakes still matters. But we do know that the way this cake has been distributed and the way economic activity has been organized has led to several problems, such as increasing inequality and environmental problems, of course. And once again, you do see that very clearly for India as well. So here's, while we wait for the next round of the NSS data to be published, this is based on the NSS consumption expenditure data. You can clearly see that the rise in inequality going by the Gini coefficient over the years, as you can see more, as we move from the green to the red on the scale between 2004-5 and 2010. It has also meant that with the advent of various alternative indicators of trying to mark progress, such as meaning of life, the unhappiness with increasing materialism, and so on and so forth. And there are some interesting studies now which actually throw up evidence on these, including the fairly inverse relationship between a study between meaning of life and GDP per capita, which one interesting study tried to do. And of course, one of the most important things on which there is quite a bit of evidence now is on the way there have been unbalanced relationships of power. Please leave it doesn't matter. Okay, I hope that's better. Thank you. Can I continue, please? Just leave it. Thank you. Okay, so the unbalanced relationships of power. And this actually brings me also to the links very nicely to the issue of the environment again. Because we know that some of the most vulnerable, some of those for whom climate justice really matters, and are those who are at the bottom of this ladder, and who are vulnerable in many, many ways and have weak bargaining power. And there's a lot of evidence around the world which has emerged on this issue. So the diagram that the graphic that you see here was actually done by an Ethiopian friend of mine while we were sitting at one of the IPCC meetings. And so the plenary session was on, and he was listening to the debates going on among the delegates in the room, and he just drew this sitting next to me. And he asked me for a caption, and that was the caption I coined. I know my wealth is in my livestock, I know not its value for the bank. And I thought he had captured that very well. So the question that then arises is that when you start putting economic development, economic growth, human development, and planetary welfare together, how do we get to understanding what matters? And as economists today, as social scientists, I would rather say, we have some clear criteria that have emerged, alternative ways of looking at what matters, from preference satisfaction to happiness indices, to trying to get at capabilities to function, operational, how do you operationalize it, status consumption, meaning of life, and lots of attempts to measure these, all of which reflect the urge to be able to better integrate economic growth and human development. But what still remains is, even after we evolve this criteria, how best do we get at guiding principles for distribution, for evaluating how well we have done on the distribution front? So we have, again, for economists, there's been utilitarianism, there's been Rawlsian principles, there's sufficientarianism, there's moving from affluent societies to achieving societies, and so on. But the fact of the matter is that there is no consensus on this, and hence the need for policy to be very sensitive on the issues of what distributive principles can be applied to evaluate how well we are doing on this front. Welfare is multidimensional, it is normative, it encompasses a whole host of values. Economic growth, it has to be clearly recognized and accommodated within policy making that economic growth impacts some dimensions of welfare positively, but it also impacts several dimensions negatively. And that has to be the starting point also when we think of the environment specifically. So here's a diagram taken from the Millennium Ecosystem Assessment, a graphic from it, which actually tells you about a whole host of services that emanate from ecosystem services, from the ecosystems, natural ecosystems. In this particular case, it's actually looking at ecosystem services coming from forests, and you can see immediately what two things that appear. One is economic indicators, as conventionally understood, would be able to quantify and capture only very few of these services that natural capital provides. The second thing that, of course, hits you is that, yes, economic growth as conventionally pursued would lead to negative impacts on several of these services. So this is just an illustration of what sort of planetary boundaries we set would matter for the future. I would like to end by summarizing three key messages that come out of it. One, that economic growth is not a social objective in itself, and this is something that policy making needs to be very sensitive to. The public policy focus must be on achieving social objectives, and the imperatives today are to take environmental degradation, alienation, unrestricted growth of corporate power, and the unequal bargaining power it leads to on board squarely. That social objectives involve intra and intergenerational synergies and trade-offs. And this is also something that has to be recognized at the outset. It's not an add-on, which is what it often becomes when we do our economic policy making. the quality of growth matters. Thank you.
Thank you, Professor Dasgupta. The next intervention will be by Professor Mirza Gopal Jay. She is professor at the Center for Law and Governance at JNU, and she is also recipient of A.K. Kumaraswamy Book Prize for her book Citizenship and its Discontent on Indian History.
Thank you, Professor Panda. So I don't have PowerPoint. As Ravi would say, that's the good news. Okay, so what I propose to do is to give you a very brief overview of the chapter with which I was associated as one of the multiple lead authors. And this is chapter 2 of the report. It was titled Social Progress, A Compass. We had a little gift given to us at one of our meetings, which was actually a compass, a little sort of pocket compass. Anyway, led by the philosopher Henry Richardson and the welfare economist Eric Schockert, our group was tasked with writing a sort of framing or background chapter which would provide a normative basis or a compass for evaluating the social progress that societies have made or not made over a given period of time, and simultaneously for assessing whether a set of policies are likely to contribute to advancing social progress or to possibly inhibiting it. So our job, in other words, was to lay out the normative dimensions for both retrospective evaluations as well as prospective policy choices in terms of their implications for social progress. And it was expected that this exercise would be helpful for other chapters which work on specific themes, as you've seen, the presumption being that of the different values that we discussed in this chapter, some would be salient in each of these different areas of concern. Not all of them everywhere, but some. So the Compass chapter in the IPSP report has one or two somewhat unique features in my view. It represents a substantive attempt at justifying, not just laying out, but justifying the normative principles that we might adopt in judging social progress. Now, as we all know, there have been many reports, both from intergovernmental panels, from multilateral agencies, and so on, thinking futuristically about a range of issues: climate change, the economy, labor, the new social contract, etc. There's even been an attempt by a non-profit in the US called the Social Progress Imperative, which is trying to develop a social progress index. And what animates that index is the search for what they call a new measure that assesses and quantifies the things that really matter to real people, this was a quote, and to measure individual countries on this index. Now, if you look at the concerns of this index for human well-being, basic human needs and so on are normatively inflected. There's no question about that. But it does not self-consciously reflect on the normative assumptions that are at work when we evaluate policies and how and why they really matter. And this is one thing that this report, as opposed to many others, actually does. And another aspect, perhaps worth mentioning in passing, is that the compass distances itself from a commitment to a particular philosophical perspective, specifically that of Enlightenment thought. It opens the door for multiple alternative ways of thinking about the values and principles that can guide social progress. The assumption, therefore, is that there is no singular or privileged pathway to social progress. The compass is complex, it's multidimensional, it stretches over 100 pages, but I'll try and give you a bare bones outline of what these normative dimensions are. And they're broadly of two types: basic values and basic principles. The emphasis on the prefix basic indicates that these are values and principles that have non-derivative importance, which means that their normative significance does not derive from any other value or any other principle. And in addition to these basic values and basic principles, there are two cross-cutting foundational considerations, as we call them in the report: the principle of equal dignity and the principle of respect for pluralism, equal dignity and pluralism. And these two foundational considerations are supposed to guide any use of the basic values and principles. So what are these values and principles? Very quickly, values bear on the evaluation of states of affairs. They can inspire, they can also guide actions. And the basic values are well-being, freedom, non-alienation, solidarity, social relations, esteem and recognition, cultural goods, environmental values, and security. I can see that a PowerPoint would have been useful. Anyway, clearly, well-being and freedom have great social importance, while many of the others on the list, such as non-alienation or esteem, could be seen as attributes of individual lives, more often than not. Principles offer more specific guidance on how to rank, how to distribute, how to realize these values. Principles are classified in terms of those that have a general applicability, like basic rights, distributive justice, beneficence and generosity, and so on. Then there are principles that apply to governments, such as the rule of law, transparency, accountability, democracy, and a commitment to realizing rights, not just guaranteeing them formally, but actually realizing them. But then there are also principles that apply to civil society, like toleration or the education of citizens. And finally, a principle like global justice, and this goes back to something Ravi said, that applies to global institutions, the principle of global justice. Now, attaching apparently abstract principles to particular types of institutions signals something. What it signals is the claim that institutions also have normative relevance, and they are important for social progress. So in all, the chapter offers 21 principles for social progress in the 21st century, and I will just take one of these principles illustratively for our own present context. In the presence of huge inequalities, which have been marked in the previous two speakers' talks, and in the presence of the intensification of majoritarianism that we are seeing, it could be argued that the idea of solidarity, the principle of solidarity, is a basic principle that is in dire need of revival. And this is a much stronger idea than the Enlightenment ideal of fraternity, or even the Rawlsian idea of the overlapping consensus. The move towards a more egalitarian society arguably requires the cultivation of solidarity amongst citizens, enabling things like progressive taxation, redistribution, etc. Similarly, a plural society needs solidarity to enable citizens to live together harmoniously despite their differences, with minorities living as equal citizens in possession of equal dignity. But, as the report points out, solidarity is a principle that may have instrumental value, as in the example I just mentioned, but is also something that has a value that has a principle that has irreducible intrinsic value. It means that and it expresses the idea that we owe to each other certain ways of acting. It expresses our acceptance of others as equal. In this sense, an improvement in solidarity can be, the report argues, an independent parameter of social progress. Now, it could be argued, and the chapter leaves this dimension open for further work with some cautions, and Ravi Kanwar alluded to the decision to keep away from the temptations of devising and constructing an index, but it leaves open the idea that these principles could be translated into concrete indicators, based on which some sort of, if not index, some kind of aggregative method could be developed, possibly by assigning weights to these different values and principles, and that could potentially enable us to have meaningful conversations about how to resolve situations where principles compete, principles that we have outlined clash with each other, and how moral constraints or feasibility constraints might be factored into such a resolution. This is not unimportant because whether we look back at choices made by countries or consider choices that countries are currently faced with, it's hard to get away from the idea that there are conflicts between normative principles. The sort of, in the most sort of simplistic and vulgar iteration of this, sort of commonplace 20th century question of this type was, is the denial of freedom and civil rights acceptable if basic needs like medical care, water, shelter are met, right? The 21st century offers many more complex challenges and paradoxes which invoke values and principles to weigh questions like this. If a policy like, say, agribusiness has the potential to significantly enhance economic growth, should the fact that this will cause a significant depletion of groundwater resources, should that make us rethink the policy? Or if a society has allowed its cultural heritage to decay through determinate neglect, but has otherwise achieved high levels of well-being, should it be considered to have progressed or not? So the principles are elaborated in the report in ways that help readers to parse and figure out for themselves, or to have intelligent, meaningful conversations about how to normatively weigh these dilemmas. That's basically the scope and the range of this particular compass. Thank you.
Now I request Professor Emeritus at the Center for Economic Studies and Planning at GIM.
Thank you very much. I'm actually one of the lead authors, along with Professor Akhil Bilgrami, the philosopher from Columbia, of chapter 20 of the report, which is called Belonging and Solidarity. That's exactly what Nitya was talking about. Now, one would immediately be struck by two questions. One, what is such a chapter doing in a report on social progress? And secondly, what am I as an economist doing in such a chapter? I think the second question is more easily answered, because I think Professor Akhil Bilgrami perhaps wanted some logistical support and therefore roped me in to help him. And also perhaps there are certain common interests we have, which I will discuss in a moment, because of which he thought that it would be a good idea if I also joined in the chapter. The second the first question, which is in fact about the chapter, already Nitya has talked about the question of solidarity. I think it's based on the assumption that modern society is characterized by a certain alienation, and overcoming that alienation is in fact one of the constituents of social progress. Now, of course, the question of alienation is differently defined, differently recognized by different authors, but on the other hand, it is recognized by a wide variety of fairly diverse authors. Marx, of course, discussed alienation, specifically attributing it to capitalism, but at the same time, you actually have, even in the writings of Gandhi, for instance, a very clear recognition of alienation, in the sense of the fragmentation of society into a set of self-absorbed individuals. And he traces it also to what he called the English system, which is a kind of euphemism. From his point of view, I believe that it is in fact an allusion to capitalism. So you have diverse authors, no doubt differing greatly amongst themselves, no doubt differing also in their understanding of the concept of alienation, but nonetheless coming to certain kind of, common or overlapping themes around these topics. So this chapter is something which, of course, it has a long philosophical essay by Akhil Bilgrami, followed by a set of case studies which include Sri Lanka, Latin America, Canada, Europe, and so on, which I would not go into, and India, of course, which I would not go into. In fact, I would not like to summarize what others are saying. As a matter of fact, each author is responsible only for what he or she has written. In other words, it's not even as if absolutely everybody agrees on every word in that chapter. Each author is responsible for what he or she has written. What I'll do is basically to discuss not even my own contribution, but what I take out of that chapter. I mean, what is it about that chapter which I found of interest? And I think the first, of course, is the whole question of alienation being a very central issue of our times, attributable, whether you talk about it in terms of capitalism or you talk about it in other terms, but certainly attributable to the way that we organize society in contemporary times, and overcoming it. And as far as overcoming is concerned, again, there is an enormous commonality of perceptions, notwithstanding differences, that overcoming it requires, in some sense, the kind of reinstitution of a sense of community. In other words, a revival of a kind of community which is essential for overcoming alienation, at least minimally defined as a fragmentation of society into self-absorbed individuals. Now, this notion of a community is there in Marx in terms of the proletariat, and this notion of community is there in many other writers, including Gandhi, for instance, who actually saw the revival of the community as an essential part of liberation. In fact, he saw liberation from colonialism not just consisting in political independence, not just consisting in high rates of GDP growth, but in actually reinstituting a sense of community which had been broken and disrupted, admittedly on a newer basis by overcoming untouchability and the evils of the caste system. But nonetheless, it did see it in terms of reinstituting a sense of community which had been disrupted by what he called the English system. Now, if one sees this in the Indian context, any notion of a reinstitution of a community would necessarily mean annihilation of caste, because it is, after all, one phenomenon which so institutionally inequalizes society that you really cannot have any sense of a community unless you actually think in terms of annihilation of caste. Now, annihilation of caste is something which cannot be achieved through identity politics. One may support identity politics, one may support certain kinds of identity politics, but support for these kinds of identity politics amounts in effect to a support for certain kinds of reforms within the existing order rather than a transcendence of this order. And consequently, the idea is really to go beyond identity politics. But how do we do that? One of the suggestions is that we can think in terms of envisaging a community of equal citizens. In other words, that differences in caste and differences in gender and other kinds of identities can be transcended in a perception of a community of equal citizens. Now, in a sense, that is something, for instance, that we have underlying the kind of vision of the Indian Constitution. But one of the suggestions that we make in this chapter is that this notion of a community of equal citizens can be institutionalized by talking not just about citizens with individual political rights, which is what our Constitution talks about, but also citizens with economic rights. In other words, citizens who enjoy a set of economic rights in the form of right to food, right to employment, right to free universal health care, right to free universal education, right to old age pension, disability benefits, and so on. So if we broaden the notion of citizenship to include not just the rights we enjoy as political citizens, but also a set of economic rights, then perhaps we try and kind of breathe some meaning into the idea of a community of equal citizens. Rough calculation would suggest that this is not economically prohibitive, far from it. In fact, it would probably require no more in our context than about 10% of the GDP, additional 10% of the GDP, which even assuming all of it is met through taxation, raises our tax GDP ratio to a level which is not particularly exorbitantly high. So the idea is not that we cannot afford it, the idea is we have to struggle for it. Now, of course, as Nadia said, that, that any such notion of citizenship or any such notion of rights is necessarily an individual notion. It's individuals who enjoy these rights. In that sense, you can say that while a community of equal citizens is a juridical community, but it's not a real community. In other words, it's not bringing in solidarities of the kind which the title of our chapter would like us to bring in. But the suggestion in the chapter is that even the fight for such a juridical community, even the fight for individual rights can only occur on the basis of a coming together of people, and therefore the very fight for individual rights is itself a way of bringing about a sense of belonging, bringing about a real community over a period of time. At any rate, these are some of the themes which are covered in the chapter 20. Thank you.
Thank you, Professor Patnaik. Now we'll have the release of the social progress report, and apart from requesting the current speakers, I would also invite the panel members for the next panel. Professor Aruna Babu, Professor Patnaik, Mrs. Pamela, and please come.
Do we want to be in the middle here?
Which camera?